or substance abuse. Saying those are not legal problems, those are community problems. Let's work to resolve those at the community level. And we can use these vacant lots, we can cut the grass, and we can convene conflict resolution sessions. So instead of calling the police, you call us. And by calling us, you eliminate the conditions for police brutality to arise, because you eliminate the need for police. And these vacant lots on a regular basis serve as open air markets for people who are in the community making soaps, making candles, and making all of the various things that you have to make to survive in a neighborhood with 100% unemployment. Right? Folks are selling their fresh produce they growing in the backyard or in the community gardens, and they're selling the candles they make. On the other hand, you have other things like, large urban agricultural centers. Feed 'em Freedom Growers is one that's very important. And Wayne Curtis, one of the founders of Feed 'em Freedom, and it started, they had a vacant lot next to their house, and they said, we ought to start a garden. So they did. And now they have a whole, the east side of Detroit. Feed 'em Freedom is feeding freedom to the east side of Detroit in the sense that they are supplying the subsistence in regards to produce for human beings throughout the east side of Detroit. And Wayne Curtis kind of, what he saw happen, he was a cat who was one of the leading members of the Black Panther Party in Detroit in the 60s. He was also a Vietnam vet. And he would say that when he was in Vietnam, one of the things that he had to do was burn down the villages of the North Vietnamese. And he would say that every time they would burn a village down, within 4 or 5 days, that village would completely reappear in another geographic location. And from that, Wayne said that the fact that these Vietnamese peasants had built these villages, they built these alternatives to the colonial system. And as a consequence of building that alternative to the colonial system and the relationships they built with each other that were necessary to build that institution, they underwent a collective personal transformation that meant that they could not be defeated in the struggle against colonialism, in the struggle against colonialism, and in the struggle to create a world of their own imagining. Right now, we're here in New York, and I'm a co-founder of a collective called Growing Roots, which is devoted to raising questions about the construction of alternative institutions here in New York City. And I specifically state New York City because in Detroit, which is all well and good, it's a struggle. They trying to, it ain't like it's all, bread and roses. They trying to take that, the city and private corporations trying to take that land back right now. So it's a demands-based defensive struggle happening simultaneously with the building of dual structures. But the material basis for those relationships in Detroit is vacant lots. Ain't a whole lot of vacant lots here. But the vacant lots alone don't guarantee the maintenance of those alternative institutions. What guarantees the maintenance of those alternative institutions is the personal transformation that those who have participated in building them have undergone as a consequence of being active in that construction. So while it's real easy to get caught up in replicating what's happening in cities throughout the Midwest that have been devastated by deindustrialization and thereby creating the opportunities to build these institutions, and we have a very different set of circumstances here. But what I take from Detroit is the transformative power of these relationships. It's these relationships that have been built amongst people who have been active in building these institutions that allows them to thrive. Relationship can happen in any context. It's a matter of how you decide to intentionally build it. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and pass it to Amaka.
Which has basically taken, and been inspired by the work being done in Detroit and by the Bog Center and, Detroit Summer and Feed 'em Freedom and all of these organizations in Detroit, and began thinking about how do we translate, some of the questions that they're trying to ask and answer there. How do we think about that in a New York context? clearly the New York context is very, very different than Detroit, both obvious and in obvious and not so obvious ways. You know, for one, you know, as Matt had mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of vacant lots there. You know, here we have a lot more people and less land. You know, land is at a premium here in ways in which isn't in Detroit. But also, you know, the fact that, you know, New York is the center of, you know, finance capital in the United States, and even looking at the impact of the recession here is very different. If you go to, you know, Detroit, where a recession has essentially been happening for the past 40 years, it looks very different, and the terrain is very different there. Thinking about how, you know, how basic needs, how to meet basic needs is a different question as well. We live in a city in which we know that our trash is going to be picked up, you know, maybe 3 or 4 days a week, or, you know, in a city like Detroit, that is not a guaranteed thing. And what has happened in Detroit is that they have seen, you know, this is a challenge, but they've used it as an opportunity to build these alternative institutions because they need these alternative institutions to meet their basic needs. We all know of the urban gardens and the urban farms, which, you know, people have taken the vacant lots and used urban gardens and urban farms to feed each other. But, you know, this point is almost not an option there. There are no grocery stores to feed people in certain areas, and so people really are depending on these urban farms and urban gardens in a way that isn't quite happening in a city like New York. And so that does pose us particular challenges. However, you know, we really want, in organizing this conference, we really have been trying to think through those types of ideas in the New York context. And one of the things that we can take from Detroit is this idea of the reimagining, right? Reimagining what is the purpose of the city, and how do we want to see our cities? How do cities meet our everyday human needs? You know, how, and that goes from both structurally as well as to social relations. Reimagining everything from what do you want, you know, the relationships to be with your neighbors, to what is healthcare? What should healthcare look like? You know, from the very micro to the very macro. And so, you know, we've organized this conference in a way in which we really want you guys to look at these sessions as, you know, laboratories for creativity. You know, we really want you guys to place yourself in a space where you can really begin to imagine how to think through what we actually want. What is our vision? What are we fighting? What is the end? What do we see? You know, and not because we're living in a fantasy land, but because the conditions require us to think differently about the way that we've been doing things. And so, you know, it's going to be challenging for many of us in these sessions, but, you know, we do want us to think about what is our vision for particular issues, as well as, and how do those fit into the vision that we see for the city. Assessing the work that we are doing already, you know, taking the good things, thinking through the things that are not working so well, and assessing our work according to that vision that we'll, you know, be thinking about building in these sessions later on today. And then, you know, synthesizing some of those visions in order to think about how do these particular issues fit into how we envision the city. So we're really excited, you know, for all of us that have put this conference together, and really, you know, want to, is this question of new knowledge that's being produced. We want this space to be a place for us to reflect and create some of those new knowledges in order to push our work forward. So, yeah.
The next panelist that will talk is Nancy Romer. She's the general coordinator of the Brooklyn Food Coalition. Thank you, Nancy. Yes, I need to put the presentation.
I was at the conference yesterday and I thought, PowerPoint. It's minimal. It's minimal. It's more, I'm doing a little top value. So if you can find it, it's the most recent cribbing last night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
hear you.
It's not, is it coming up? Okay. Okay, yeah. This is the Brooklyn Food Coalition. So I'm going to tell you a little personal story. And then I hope to be able to figure out how to do that. So I'm Nancy Romer. I'm the general coordinator of the Brooklyn Food Coalition. We've been in existence since 2009, so we're sort of a new organization. And when Rachel was talking about, how do we get these community organizations to have a bigger idea, really, I think that's exactly how I personally came to the Brooklyn Food Coalition. I'm a veteran, as you can imagine, of many boards, SLAM and PSC together, so Rachel and I have been stomping around in the same locations for a while. But a lot of work in the labor movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the anti-racist movement, I cut my eye teeth in the tenants movement. And always looking at the question of how do we create a democracy? How do we really create the participation that can keep society under the control of the people and not the corporations? And of course, my life has tracked the demise, this complete corporate control of society. And in my desire to look at how do we get, what are models of how people really get engaged? About 6 years ago, I spent a lot of time in Latin America, and I followed the food sovereignty movement. Basically, food sovereignty is the idea that people should have control over the food system, that in their own location, in their own nation, in their own community, control over production of food, over the processing of food, distribution, and the quality of food, what's produced. And I saw this incredibly radical and transformative movement on the ground of millions of people, and learned about an amazing organization called La Via Campesina. I don't know how many of you, have any of you heard of La Via Campesina? Okay, great. Usually when I speak to even food activist audiences, they've never heard of it. It is a 200 million member organization in over 100 countries. It's mostly landless peasants and small holders and fisher folk and pastoralists and allies. And they are involved in the struggle against land grabs. They are involved in the redistribution of land. And so when you look at, for example, the overthrow of Zelaya, the coup against Zelaya in Honduras, what the New York Times forgot to tell us is that right before the coup, Zelaya was moving toward land reform. And that is not what the capitalists want to see. So guess what? There was a coup, and of course, the United States government, sort of ho-hummed it a little bit and said, oh, that's very bad, and didn't do anything about it, because they're also nervous about land distribution. But this is what's going on in the global South. And I think one of the things that I have felt lacking in my own understanding as an activist my whole life has been, I've always had a theoretical alliance with the global South, with the struggles of peoples all over the world, but it wasn't very concrete. And I saw that food sovereignty was a way of connecting that was very profound. And when I came back to the United States, of course, it's equally profound. And what I want to do is just show you some. I want to show you that there's a war on our people. You know this, because you know that there's a war on our people in so many areas, but I want to show it to you in food. So we know that people are stuffed and starved in this nation. We know that 1 in 6 New Yorkers is food insecure, which means that they have trouble getting food on the table. Not every day, but many days. And when you look at the lines in food pantries, which are very interesting organizations, they have tremendous potential. They're not doing much more than just giving food out now. They could be doing so much more. So people are really struggling with this. So we're starved and we're stuffed. We're stuffed because of two big reasons. Corporations have control over the agriculture and they are producing a lot of, they're producing corn, wheat, soy, and rice, and all of those are things that are making us fat. They're also the things that are feeding cheap animal agriculture and the fast food industry. That's what's happening. And so they are able, with government subsidies, our tax money, they're able to make a lot of cheap food and then sell it at relatively cheap prices. Americans spend much less on food than any other people. And then we have this interesting thing. We've got food stamps, right? Oh, we're such a good people. We have food stamps. Our food stamp nation, right? According to Gingrich. But the level of food stamps is so low that guess what? The people on food stamps can only afford those cheap prices of the food that's making them fat and making them sick. And so it's a double subsidy for agribusiness and the fast food and junk food industries. We're just giving that money right back because poor people can't afford to buy anything but that stuff. So let's take a, oh my God, 6 minutes. Let's take a quick look. I really shouldn't do this. Okay, so this tells you the percentage of people who were obese in 85. I'm just going to move through this very quickly. I grew up on pictures like this of Europe where Hitler was taking over Europe, which he certainly was. And yet, hey, look who's taking over the United States. They're taking over our bodies. They are taking over our bodies. And it's not just the bodies of people in this room, but it's mostly poor people. That's what it is. It's poor people who have very, very few choices. This is a war on our people. And this is what it looks like. So, this is Farmville. The farmers are, by the way, the zip code that gets the most subsidies from the Farm Bill is around the Upper East Side of New York City. And this is the externalities. You've heard a lot about externalities. A Big Mac costs the society a tremendous amount of money. We're subsidizing, just like we're subsidizing Walmart for their low wages, we're also subsidizing the fast food industry because they have all these externalities. So, so this is sort of the hope of the future. This is Movimiento Sin Tierra in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Anyway, so I came back and worked with a large group of people to create the Brooklyn Food Coalition, to take the idea of food sovereignty and thread it through the very largest picture, threading it through the food movement in Brooklyn. We are a grassroots organization working on projects that promote food justice, food security, and sustainability in the food system. So we have 3 pillars in the Brooklyn Food Coalition. We have, let me say this before, we have about 500 members, and we have about, I would say, a core of about 200 active people who are participating. It's an organization that's half people of color and half white folks, and most of our organizing is in Brownsville, East New York, and Bed-Stuy. That's where we have our organizing projects, and a lot of that work is working with school parents on issues of school food. Kids are coming into school, they're eating breakfast and lunch in school. 700,000 kids a day are getting their nutrition mostly from school. And that's a tremendous impact. And we're working with parents to empower them with skills to be able to demand changes in their own schools and in the system in general. And it's very reformist, but it affects a lot of people. And it's really important to be able to encourage people from low-income communities who are always told they can't do things. But in fact, they can do things. They were able to get high fructose corn syrup out of the chocolate milk formula. That sounds very little. That's not a transformative demand, except it's transformative for the parents who are able to get that done successfully. I don't want to give you a whole list of the kinds of things that we're doing on that. But I want to be able to say also that this is an issue, 2 minutes is that. This is also an issue of global warming. How many of you went to Do the Math? Okay, so Do the Math was Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein's fantastic roadshow on climate change and coming up with a strategy for how to have an impact on it. Agriculture accounts for 1/3 of all greenhouse gases. If we could occupy the food system, change the food system, we would see a tremendous decline in greenhouse gases, and we might be able to save our planet from going further and further over the brink. I mean, Hurricane Sandy showed us we've passed that point, clearly, but there's still, we can minimize the constant disasters that we know we will have to live in. So we have 3 pillars: healthy, affordable food for all, sustainable food systems, and justice for food workers. And we're big on co-ops because it is transformative. It is a different kind of economic approach to feeding people, especially when they're co-ops in which everyone has to work, like the Park Slope Food Co-op, which, by the way, has 3,000 members from Bed-Stuy. So it's called the Park Slope Food Co-op, and it's not only Park Slope. So the reason that we have these 3 pillars is that we feel very strongly that the food movement has been very non-political. It's been about wonderful farmers markets and great community gardens and CSAs and food co-ops, and all that's great. But if that movement doesn't see itself as part of the anti-corporate movement, as part of a radical approach to changing society, it's going to not function. It's not going to work well. The great thing about the food movement is it's very grassroots. It's very decentralized. There are a lot of people on the ground, as in Detroit, that are doing a lot of important work, building community, and feel comfortable with the work they're doing because it's work they're familiar with, and it's work with their neighbors. And I think those are structures we want to maintain, we want to support, but we also want to bring together in a broader politic. So yes, community gardens, yes, healthy food for all, but it can't be at the expense of food workers who are really the new sweatshop workers. We need to have the right to organize, the right to decent wages and benefits. And if people are only wanting their organic arugula and not seeing that that organic arugula is being picked by somebody who has the right to dignity and a decent life, then there's no real transformative movement going on. We also want to be able to talk about why sustainable food systems are so important, why fracking is so dangerous, because it will ultimately destroy the water and the land that we need to grow food on. Why these pipelines, these gas and oil pipelines, whether it's Keystone or Spectra. How many of you know about Spectra pipelines? Okay, yeah. Well, this is a gas pipeline that's running right through the Rockaways. Hello, Rockaways, not a great place to put a pipeline that's going to explode at some point in whatever is the next tragedy that we have here. Then it can really, really be dangerous. It will look like the BP oil, quote, spill disaster. So we feel very strongly that, no more minutes left. Okay, we feel very strongly that we want to honor the organization of people in their schools, in their communities, in their faith organizations, pull them together, try to raise the understanding of the mutuality of our work together, of healthy food for all, sustainable food systems, and justice for food workers. We're having a party Friday night. I have flyers. I hope you'll come. You don't have to live in Brooklyn to come to it because we're just right over the bridge at 33 Flatbush. But I think you'll get a sense for who's in our movement and how we build community. And I just want to thank you for being here.
Ruth Gilmore is going to have the pleasure of finishing this session. Ruth, because we're not really running late, but we're kind of running late. If we want to eat something before we enter the sessions. And before you start, I just would like to mention that there is a group from Sunset Park that is called La Unión, that is bringing us good Mexican food. This is also part of an interesting experiment here at the new school to start to introduce the street here. So they're going to be providing some food at some room 403. They're asking for any donations. They're trying to help the Latino illegal women that were affected by Sandy. So they're going to be already by 11:45, 12, no, not 11:45 because otherwise you will leave because you're hungry. Let's say by 12 or so, over there, room 403, if you feel hungry and want to grab some bites before you go get into it. Okay, to continue with the panel, sorry, Ruth, because it's a pleasure to get to meet the last panelist. She's the Associate Director of the Center for Basic Culture and Politics at the Kundalini Brecht Center, one of the co-organizers of these events. Thanks, Ruth.
Good morning. What did the gentleman say? Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Gee whiz. All right, I was going to show pictures, but in the interest of time, I will just show myself. What my remarks are about this morning is the need for us to stretch our imaginations. So the title of my few remarks is Stretch the Place of Abolition in Reimagining the City. So I should start by saying that abolition is a plot. It's a plot in two senses. It's a narrative plot. It's a narrative plot that reproduces, I'm sorry, now? Yeah? It's a narrative plot that reproduces the following pattern. Stability of unfreedom, instability either produced by the unfree or by external circumstances that the unfree can exploit, toward the goal of some kind of stabilizing freedom that's real, not just formal. That's the narrative plot of abolition. It's also a geographic plot. It is a plot in which the organization of land and resources is no longer either alienable or exclusive. You can't throw anybody out, you can't shoot anybody for putting their foot on your land, and it can never be sold. Abolition is a plot, and those are the two dimensions of the plot. So I'm a prison abolitionist, as many of you may know. So the question I ask is, where is New York City from the perspective of prisons? From the perspective of prisons, the city of New York is not these 5 boroughs. From the perspective of prisons, the city of New York is both these 5 boroughs and every single prison throughout this state. If I had a picture, which I do have on my little flash drive, if I had a picture of the state of New York with all of the prisons, adult and juvenile, sprinkled across the state, you would see that the city of New York is actually made up of these 5 boroughs plus some dozens of mini boroughs, let's say, which the prisons are. A prison is a city, so it is, at least from our perspective, New York-centric as we are, each prison is a mini borough. Most of the prisoners, as you know, who are locked up in New York State come from downstate, either these 5 counties, the counties in the city of New York, or just above, from Westchester County. So if we consider that where New York really is here and there, and that the people who really live in New York are long-distance migrants circulating between here and there, then we have to use our abolitionist imagination to say, oh, I have not yet exhausted where New York is in thinking about New York as this geometrically discontinuous place made up of macro and mini boroughs. Because in addition to the long-distance migrants who live between these boroughs and the mini boroughs upstate, are other long-distance migrants who live between these boroughs and, on the one hand, immigrant detention centers all over the United States, and on the other, long-distance migrants who, as my friend Tommy Wu taught me the other day, for example, work in the restaurant industry and ride those so-called Chinatown buses to places as far-flung as Toronto or St. Louis to work and then come home to New York Chinatown for their days off. That's where New York City is. It's in those buses where people in voluntary and involuntary ways find themselves moving through this incredibly stretched space that actually comprises New York City. So if we think about reimagining the city, we have to think about reimagining the whole city, not just this part of it. So, in this geometrically discontinuous place, what happens? I've just described a few of the things that happen, but everything else that we imagine happens in this city, happens in this city that I've asked you to imagine. All three circuits of capital are moving through this city that I've asked you to imagine. Finance, merchant, and productive. All three circuits all the time. Those circuits move both through the private and the public sphere, and in the case of prisons, the public sphere is the one that matters. Do not be beguiled by those who tell you that it's private corporations who have driven the prison boom. It's not. It's cowardly public servants, elected and appointed, who, as Willie Brown, Democrat, black Democrat, said 30 years ago, sooner or later everyone is going to have to kneel before the altar of prisons. In the city of New York that I've asked you to imagine, people then are organizing constantly. They're organizing around such issues as land use, as agriculture, such issues as education, architecture, policing. They're fighting in the front of civil law as well as criminal law. Transportation is central to the problems that people encounter, not only in these 5 boroughs, but between these 5 boroughs and all of those mini boroughs that are part of New York City. People also are working in many instances in the huge and incredibly varied informal labor market that bullies the formal labor markets in all of the major urban areas of the United States, maybe the world. I'll give you an example from Los Angeles. Yesterday, for those of you who were here, up at the GC, my hero, Tammy Banglu, was talking about Los Angeles County, a place of 4,000 square miles of 10 million people. It's a place that has such an enormous informal economy, one that's been counted actually, that the number of jobs in Los Angeles County in the formal economy are about equal today, in the year 2012, to what they were in 1994. Right? The number of jobs in the formal economy, employments as we say in my trade. All of the additional employments that people say in surveys and so forth, these are things you can actually count, that exist in Los Angeles County are in the informal economy. In the informal economy, high wage and low. So both people working, doing design work off the books for the movie industry, and people framing houses, looking after children, and so on and so on and so on. You name it, it's happening in the informal economy. I suggest that here in New York City, that informal economy, which is being organized in a number of ways, for example, by the Coalition for Excluded Workers and so forth, is one of the ways in which the real New York, the New York that I'm asking you to imagine, is constantly in the process of being organized from the grassroots up through something that Tammy and I both think of as grassroots internationalism. Also, in the real city of New York, the one that I ask you to imagine as abolitionists, the work of reproduction and of social reproduction is happening across this stretched space all of the time. And a lot of that work of reproduction and social reproduction, is occurring in the nooks and crannies of everyday life, some of which are outside the market and some of which are inside the market. But I'd like to suggest that at this moment, we can't get too excited yet, because what's outside the market might just be an example of what I might call dysfunctional dualism in the economic system of the New York that I ask us to imagine. That said, people are organizing. There's organizing happening everywhere. There's organizing, for example, that is linked upstate and downstate, agriculture and anti-prison work, into this wonderful and amazing project that has to do with food justice as well, called Milk Not Jails. How many minutes? 3, great. Milk Not Jails. Let's hear it for Milk Not Jails. There's work that is linked, these boroughs with the mini boroughs upstate, with people who live in the communities upstate where the mini boroughs are, around issues of environmental justice, and which have pinpointed the fact that that one of the major health hazards that seems to correlate, not necessarily causally, but correlate strongly with high rates of imprisonment and criminalization of young people, particularly, though not exclusively people of color, is asthma produced by environmental toxins that are produced by the effluence of inefficient transportation systems and so on. So, what perhaps we can take into the workshops that will start a little bit after we get all this delicious food that we just heard about is to think about this stretch and to think about all of the kinds of work that is happening along this stretch and to start from the presupposition that people are actually already making the connections that we're always calling for, that is actually always happening, and then put our eyes, put our imaginations into that work and think about how that work might be scaled up. And I just want to end with one last kind of unpleasant stretch, but it's one that should reinvigorate our commitment to doing the work that we're all here to do. And that is the kind of stretch that has effectively, and for so long, almost in a normalizing way, produced round after round after round after round of criminalization here in the real city, the abolitionist city of New York. The work that has changed all kinds of behaviors into criminal behaviors, that has criminalized people for things that they do as well as things that they don't do. This kind of criminalization has put together the international military agenda of the United States with the domestic militarization of the United States, such that, for example, in 2008, as many of you probably know, the New York City Police Department Terrorism Interdiction Unit wrote a memo, just a briefing memo, on one day in 2008, in which they seamlessly connected everything from the expected protest in the wake of the police who killed Sean Bell, to critical resistance, to the Gina 6, which is in Louisiana, to Muslim students going on vacation upstate to do some rafting and pray. This was all one report. It was all one report. So that stretch is already happening on that side. So for any of us who imagine that any kind of silo organizing and activity remains an option for reform, much less revolution, we should think, perhaps think that again. So I want to thank you all for coming out. I encourage you to join the Abolitionist Club.
Yeah. Yeah.
To ask more than questions to the panelists because we're going to be in the workshops and there's going to be a lot of discussion. If you have some words of encouragement, just to